If the man you love hates you, the greatest mistake you can make is trying to win his heart. Those were the first words Elliot Carter remembered hearing after opening his eyes in a room that belonged to someone else. The ceiling above him was painted with golden patterns, the kind of details he had only seen in old fantasy movies, and the heavy curtains beside the bed looked like they belonged in a royal palace rather than a normal bedroom. For a few seconds, Elliot simply stared upward, waiting for his mind to catch up. The last thing he remembered was sitting in his apartment in New York, reading a fantasy novel about a powerful king and the husband everyone in the kingdom despised. Then came the strange feeling of falling asleep. Now he was somewhere impossible. He slowly sat up, noticing the unfamiliar silk shirt, the elegant furniture, and the reflection staring back at him from the mirror across the room. The face was not his. It was the face of Elliot Vallon, the character from the novel. The character who had been written as a jealous, misunderstood nobleman. The character who lost everything because nobody believed his side of the story. Elliot's heart sank as memories that did not belong to him rushed through his mind. A royal marriage arranged for politics. A cold king who never smiled at him. A palace full of people who whispered whenever he walked by. And the worst part was the name of the person connected to all of it. King Adrian Whitmore, the ruler of Aurelian. The man who had married Elliot Vallon but never truly accepted him. Elliot looked around the beautiful room and let out a quiet laugh. It was not a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh someone made when life became too ridiculous to understand. Out of every possible person I could have become, I had to become the king's most hated husband. In the original story, this version of Elliot spent every day trying to gain Adrian's attention. He followed him, apologized for things he did not remember doing, and desperately searched for affection from someone who had already decided not to give it. But Elliot Carter was not the same person. He knew what it felt like to be ignored. He knew what it felt like to chase approval from people who had already made up their minds. He had no desire to repeat that story. A quiet knock came from the door. The entire room seemed to change in an instant. Servants stood straighter. The atmosphere became tense. Elliot did not need anyone to announce who was entering. The door opened, and King Adrian Whitmore stepped inside. He was exactly how the novel described him. Calm, elegant, impossible to read. His dark coat was perfectly arranged, and his expression carried the weight of a man who had spent years carrying an entire kingdom on his shoulders. His eyes moved toward Elliot, and there was no warmth there, only distance. "You are awake," Adrian said. His voice was steady, almost emotionless. Elliot looked at the king who had once been the center of this character's world. Then he made a decision that would change everything. He would not beg. He would not chase. He would not spend his new life trying to convince someone to see his worth. Elliot simply nodded and replied, "Yes, I am awake." For the first time, King Adrian looked surprised. It was a small reaction, almost invisible, but Elliot noticed it, and he realized something important. The story he had entered was already changing. The silence after Elliot answered was heavier than any accusation. King Adrian Whitmore stood near the doorway, studying him as if he was looking at a completely different person wearing a familiar face. In the past, Elliot Vallon would have immediately tried to explain himself. He would have searched for the right words, the right expression, anything that might soften the king's cold opinion. But Elliot Carter had already learned one important lesson from his old life. Some people only notice your value after they realize you are no longer waiting for their approval. Adrian walked farther into the room, his calm expression never changing. "You seem different today," the king said. Elliot glanced toward the window, watching the morning light spread across the palace gardens. He wondered how many mornings the original Elliot had spent staring at that same view, hoping for a kindness that never came. "Perhaps I simply grew tired," Elliot replied. The answer was simple, but it carried a meaning Adrian did not expect. The king's eyes narrowed slightly. "Tired of what?" Elliot looked back at him. "Trying to prove something to someone who has already decided what they think of me." For a moment, the room became completely quiet. Adrian was a man who commanded armies, ruled a kingdom, and negotiated with powerful nobles. Yet somehow, a few honest words from his own husband seemed to leave him without a response. Before Adrian could continue, a palace attendant entered with the day's schedule. Elliot noticed how quickly the room changed when Adrian was present. Everyone moved carefully around him. Every word was chosen. Every action was controlled. It reminded Elliot that Adrian was not only a husband in this strange new life. He was also a king carrying responsibilities far beyond their marriage. As the attendant explained the royal meetings, Elliot quietly stepped away. He did not ask Adrian where he would be going. He did not ask whether they could spend time together. He simply accepted that their paths were separate. That small action confused Adrian more than any argument could have. Later that afternoon, Elliot walked through the palace gardens alone. The place was beautiful, filled with flowers, fountains, and quiet pathways. For the first time since arriving, he felt like he could breathe. He was no longer trying to play the role that everyone expected from Elliot Vallon. He was simply himself. A few palace workers greeted him politely, surprised when he responded warmly instead of demanding attention. News traveled quickly inside a royal palace. By evening, Adrian had already heard that his husband had spent the day helping organize supplies for the palace library and speaking kindly with servants. It was strange. The Elliot he remembered had always been desperate to be noticed. This Elliot seemed perfectly content being ignored. Adrian sat alone in his office that night, looking over documents but finding it difficult to focus. He could not understand why the change bothered him. He had wanted distance. He had wanted a marriage without emotional expectations. So why did Elliot's silence feel different from before? Why did the absence of those familiar attempts for attention suddenly feel like something missing? Adrian closed the document in front of him and looked toward the dark window. For years, he believed he knew exactly who Elliot Vallon was. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had been wrong all along. And somewhere deep inside, a question he never expected began to appear. Who was the person standing beside him now? The next few days inside the royal palace felt strangely peaceful for Elliot. That was the part that surprised him the most. He had expected chaos, suspicion, and constant pressure after waking up in the body of someone everyone disliked. Instead, the biggest challenge was learning how to exist in a world where every small action carried meaning. In the palace, a simple conversation could become a rumor. A polite smile could become a political statement. Even choosing where to sit at breakfast could tell people exactly what kind of person they believed you were. The old Elliot Vallon had spent years trying to control those opinions. The new Elliot had decided he would stop fighting battles that were never his to begin with. Every morning, he ate breakfast quietly. He walked through the gardens. He visited the royal library, where he discovered shelves filled with history books, maps, and stories about the kingdom of Aurelian. The palace workers slowly became less nervous around him. They expected arrogance, but they found patience. They expected complaints, but they found gratitude. One afternoon, Elliot noticed a young servant struggling to carry a stack of books across the hallway. Without thinking, he stepped forward and helped organize the heavy pile. The servant looked shocked. "Your Highness, you do not need to do that." Elliot smiled softly. "A title does not mean I cannot help someone." The moment was small. It lasted only a few seconds. But someone else saw it. From the balcony above the courtyard, King Adrian watched silently. He had been walking through the palace when he noticed the scene below. He expected to see the same person he remembered. Someone trying to impress others. Someone performing kindness because he wanted recognition. But that was not what he saw. Elliot did not even realize he was being watched. He simply helped because it felt natural. Adrian found that detail strangely difficult to ignore. Later that evening, the king received a report from his advisors. They spoke about Elliot's unusual behavior with confusion. "The prince consort has changed," one advisor said carefully. "He seems less interested in gaining influence." Adrian remained silent. He looked down at the documents on his desk, but his thoughts were somewhere else. Less interested in influence. Less interested in him. That was the part Adrian could not understand. For years, he had believed Elliot's actions were always motivated by ambition. He had convinced himself that every request, every attempt at conversation, and every effort to stay close was part of a plan. But now Elliot had stopped doing all of those things. And somehow, that made Adrian notice him more. The king remembered the moment Elliot had calmly said he was tired of proving himself. Those words had stayed in his mind longer than they should have. Nobody spoke to Adrian like that. Most people carefully chose every sentence around him because they feared making a mistake. But Elliot had looked directly at him and simply told the truth. That night, Adrian walked past Elliot's room by coincidence. At least, that was what he told himself. He stopped for a moment when he noticed the light still on inside. Before, he would have ignored it. Before, he would have walked away without a second thought. But now he wondered what Elliot was doing. He wondered what had changed. And for the first time in years, King Adrian Whitmore found himself curious about the person he had spent so long believing he already understood. Adrian told himself he was only curious. That was the explanation he repeated every time his attention drifted toward Elliot. Curiosity was harmless. Curiosity did not mean anything. A king had the right to understand the people inside his own palace. At least, that was what Adrian wanted to believe. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore. Something about Elliot had changed, and the more Adrian observed, the less he understood the man standing in front of him. The Elliot he remembered always searched for his attention. He would wait outside meeting rooms, create reasons to speak with him, and carefully watch every reaction as if Adrian's smallest expression could decide his entire day. This new Elliot was different. He greeted Adrian politely, but he never tried to continue the conversation. He showed respect, but he no longer looked like he was hoping for something in return. At first, Adrian thought it was an act. He believed Elliot would eventually return to his old habits once he realized the king was not reacting. But days passed, and nothing changed. One morning, Adrian entered the royal dining hall expecting the usual silence between them. Elliot was already there, reading a history book while enjoying breakfast. When Adrian sat down, Elliot simply nodded. "Good morning, Your Majesty." That was all. No questions. No attempts to make the moment longer. Adrian looked at him for a second longer than necessary. "You seem busy." Elliot closed the book and smiled slightly. "I was reading about Aurelian's old trade routes. I thought it would help me understand the kingdom better." Adrian paused. Before, Elliot had rarely shown interest in anything beyond their relationship. "Why?" he asked. Elliot looked confused. "Why what? Why are you trying to understand the kingdom?" Elliot thought about the question for a moment. "Because I live here." The simple answer caught Adrian off guard. There was no hidden request behind it. No attempt to gain approval. Just a straightforward truth. Later that day, Adrian attended a meeting with several royal advisors. The conversation eventually turned toward Elliot, and Adrian noticed something unusual. The advisors no longer spoke about him with the same certainty as before. "The prince consort has become more involved with the palace staff," one advisor mentioned. "The rumors about his behavior seem less accurate now." Adrian looked up immediately. Less accurate. Those words bothered him. For years, he had accepted every rumor about Elliot without question. He had built an image of him in his mind and never allowed himself to see anything else. That evening, Adrian found himself walking through the palace gardens again. He saw Elliot sitting near the fountain, writing notes in a small journal. The peaceful expression on Elliot's face was unfamiliar. It was the expression of someone who had finally stopped fighting for a place where he belonged. Adrian approached before he could stop himself. Elliot looked up in surprise. "Your Majesty?" Adrian remained quiet for a moment. He had no reason to be there. No official matter. No royal announcement. He had simply wanted to speak. "You have changed," Adrian finally said. Elliot looked down at the journal in his hands. "Maybe I have." "Why?" Adrian asked. Elliot was silent for a moment before answering. "Because I realized something. I cannot force someone to see my worth." The words were calm, but they carried a weight Adrian could feel. He remembered every time Elliot had tried to reach him. Every time he had looked away. Every time he had assumed the worst. For the first time, Adrian wondered how much pain he had caused by never trying to understand. Elliot stood and gave a respectful nod before leaving the garden. Adrian watched him walk away, feeling a strange emptiness after the conversation ended. The king had spent years wanting distance. Yet now that Elliot had finally given him exactly that, Adrian discovered he did not like it at all. For the first time since arriving at the palace, Elliot began to feel like he was no longer trapped inside someone else's story. He knew he was still living as Elliot Vallon, the man whose name carried years of rumors and misunderstandings. But each day he spent being himself made that identity feel less like a burden. He was not trying to become a different person. He was simply refusing to continue living as someone everyone else had already decided to hate. What Elliot did not realize was that his quiet changes were reaching places he never expected. Especially one person. King Adrian Whitmore had always believed that understanding people was one of his greatest strengths. He could read a room, recognize hidden intentions, and predict the choices of those around him. But Elliot had become the one person Adrian could not figure out. The more Adrian watched him, the more questions appeared. A few days later, the palace prepared for a royal gathering with important families from across Aurelian. It was a traditional event where nobles gathered to discuss the future of the kingdom. In the past, Elliot Vallon would have spent hours preparing for such an occasion, hoping to stand beside Adrian and prove that he belonged. This time, Elliot simply chose a simple but elegant outfit and focused on enjoying the evening. When he entered the grand hall, many conversations became quieter. Old habits were difficult to erase. Some nobles still remembered the rumors. Some still looked at him with doubt. Elliot noticed, but he did not let it control him. He walked forward with calm confidence, greeting people respectfully without trying to win anyone over. Adrian watched from across the room. He expected Elliot to seek his attention. Instead, Elliot spent his time speaking with guests, listening to their stories, and showing genuine interest in the people around him. There was something different about him, something real. During the gathering, a discussion began about a small village near the northern border that needed additional support with supplies and resources. Several nobles dismissed the issue quickly, saying it was not important enough to discuss during a royal event. Elliot quietly spoke up. If the people of the kingdom are struggling, then it is important enough to discuss. The room became silent. It was not a dramatic statement. It was simply honest. Adrian looked at Elliot carefully. This was not the person he thought he knew. This was someone who cared about others without expecting praise. After the gathering ended, Adrian found Elliot near the palace balcony, looking over the lights of the city below. "You surprised many people tonight," Adrian said. Elliot turned around. "I did not intend to surprise anyone." Adrian studied him. "Then what did you intend?" Elliot smiled faintly. "To do what I believed was right." That answer stayed with Adrian. Before, he had always assumed Elliot's actions had a hidden purpose. But now he was beginning to see something uncomfortable. Perhaps the problem was never Elliot's intentions. Perhaps the problem was that Adrian had never taken the time to truly see him. Later that night, Adrian returned to his office, but found himself unable to focus. The image of Elliot standing in the hall kept returning to his mind. The confidence in his voice, the kindness in his actions, the peaceful expression of someone who no longer needed anyone's approval. For years, Adrian had believed Elliot was trying to take something from him. But now he wondered if Elliot had only wanted something much simpler, to be understood. And that realization was harder for the king to accept than he expected. Adrian had spent years believing that control was the foundation of a strong ruler. Every decision needed logic. Every emotion needed restraint. A king could not allow uncertainty to influence his judgment. Yet lately, uncertainty was the only thing Elliot Vallon seemed to create inside him. The more Adrian learned about the person standing beside him, the more he questioned the memories he had trusted for so long. He remembered Elliot as someone who always demanded attention, someone who seemed desperate to be accepted by the royal family. But the man Adrian saw now was completely different. He was calm, independent, almost impossible to reach. And that was what bothered Adrian the most. One afternoon, Adrian passed by the royal library and noticed Elliot sitting near the window with several old books spread across the table. Sunlight fell across the pages, creating a quiet scene that felt strangely peaceful. Adrian stopped at the doorway without announcing his presence. He watched as Elliot carefully studied maps of Aurelian, making notes about different regions and their people. There was no audience. No one was there to praise him. Elliot was simply learning because he wanted to understand the kingdom better. "You spend a great deal of time here," Adrian finally said. Elliot looked up, slightly surprised. "Your Majesty." He closed the book gently. "I suppose I do." Adrian walked closer. "Why are you studying these things now?" Elliot looked at the map in front of him before answering. "Because I realized I cannot live in a place without understanding it." The answer was simple, but Adrian felt the meaning behind it. Elliot was no longer trying to prove that he deserved a place beside him. He was creating his own place. "You have changed," Adrian said quietly. Elliot smiled a little. People change when they stop trying to become someone else. Adrian had no response. The words stayed with him long after he left the library. That evening, the king attended a meeting with his advisors. Usually, these discussions were focused entirely on political matters, but one topic unexpectedly caught his attention. Several nobles mentioned Elliot's recent actions throughout the palace. They spoke about how the servants seemed more comfortable around him. They spoke about how he listened before making decisions. They spoke about how the rumors surrounding him no longer matched what they saw. Adrian remained silent, but every word added another piece to a puzzle he had refused to solve. Later that night, Adrian found himself standing outside the garden where Elliot often spent his evenings. He told himself he was simply passing through. But deep down, he knew that was not true. Elliot was sitting beneath a tree, reading quietly. When he noticed Adrian, he immediately stood. "Is there something you need?" The question was polite, but it was different from before. There was no hope hidden behind it. No expectation. Adrian felt a strange discomfort because he realized Elliot was treating him like any other person. "No," Adrian answered after a moment. "I just wanted to speak with you." Elliot looked surprised. "About what?" Adrian searched for the right words. For years, he had never struggled to speak to Elliot because he had never cared what Elliot felt. But now, every sentence seemed important. "I think I may have misunderstood you." The confession felt unfamiliar. Adrian Whitmore was not a man who easily admitted mistakes. Elliot studied him quietly. "Why do you think that?" Adrian looked away toward the palace lights in the distance. "Because I judged you before I truly knew you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was not forgiveness. It was not love. Not yet. But it was the first honest conversation they had shared in years. And for the first time, Adrian realized that the distance he once wanted was becoming the one thing he feared losing. Adrian had expected many things from his life as king. He expected difficult decisions, endless responsibilities, and moments when he would have to choose the future of Aurelian over his own wishes. What he never expected was that the person he once tried to keep at a distance would become the person he wanted to understand the most. After their conversation in the garden, something between Adrian and Elliot quietly changed. It was not a dramatic transformation. There was no sudden confession or impossible promise. Instead, it was built from small moments that neither of them mentioned. A simple conversation during breakfast. A question about Elliot's opinion during a royal meeting. A brief smile when their eyes met across the palace hall. Adrian began noticing details he had ignored before. He noticed how Elliot always remembered the names of palace workers. He noticed how carefully he listened when others spoke. He noticed that Elliot never used kindness as a way to gain influence. It was simply who he was. The realization was both comforting and frustrating. Because the more Adrian saw the truth, the more he had to accept that he had been wrong for years. Meanwhile, Elliot remained careful. He appreciated that Adrian was treating him differently, but he refused to build expectations too quickly. He remembered the loneliness of the past Elliot. He remembered how painful it was to keep hoping for affection from someone who had already turned away. This time, he promised himself he would protect his own heart. One afternoon, the palace received unexpected news. A group of nobles had requested a formal discussion regarding Elliot's position in the royal family. The rumors from the past had not disappeared completely, and some people still believed Elliot did not deserve his place beside the king. When Adrian heard about the meeting, his expression immediately changed. In the past, he might have ignored the situation. He might have allowed others to decide Elliot's fate because he believed he understood the truth already. But now, he felt something different. He felt the need to stand beside Elliot. Before the meeting began, Adrian found Elliot in the library. "They are questioning your role in the palace," Adrian said. Elliot looked up calmly. "I expected that might happen." Adrian studied him. "You are not worried?" Elliot closed the book in front of him. "I cannot control what people believe. I can only control how I act." That answer stayed with Adrian. Elliot was no longer the person who needed someone else to save him. He had become someone who could stand on his own. And somehow, that made Adrian want to support him even more. During the meeting, the nobles spoke about old rumors and past misunderstandings. Elliot listened quietly. He did not interrupt. He did not try to defend himself with anger. He simply answered every question with honesty and patience. Adrian watched from beside him, realizing something important. Elliot did not need him to fight his battles. But Adrian wanted to stand with him anyway. When the discussion ended, Adrian spoke clearly. "Elliot Vallon has shown loyalty to this kingdom through his actions, not through empty promises. I will not allow people to judge him only by stories from the past." The room became silent. Elliot looked at Adrian with surprise. He had expected respect. He had not expected support. Later that evening, they stood together in the palace corridor. "You did not have to do that," Elliot said softly. Adrian looked at him. "I know." A quiet moment passed between them. Then Adrian added, "But I wanted to." And for the first time, Elliot saw something in the king's eyes that had never been there before. Not duty, not obligation, something much more personal. Adrian had always believed that a king should never hesitate. A ruler who allowed uncertainty to guide his choices would eventually lose the trust of those who depended on him. But lately, every decision involving Elliot felt different. Every moment with him created a question Adrian could not ignore. The person he once believed he understood had become someone completely new in his eyes. And the most difficult truth was that Adrian was beginning to realize Elliot had never been the problem. The problem was that Adrian had never truly looked closely enough. After the royal meeting, the atmosphere inside the palace slowly changed. The nobles who once whispered about Elliot became more careful with their words. They had seen the way Adrian supported him. They had seen the confidence and respect between the two men. But Elliot noticed something else. He noticed that Adrian seemed different when they were alone. The king who once avoided conversations now searched for them. The man who once looked away now listened. It was confusing, because Elliot had spent so much time accepting that Adrian would never care that this new behavior felt almost impossible to believe. One evening, Elliot found Adrian standing near the palace library, looking through an old collection of royal records. "I did not know you enjoyed history," Elliot said. Adrian looked up. "There are many things you do not know about me." The answer was simple, but Elliot felt the meaning behind it. He smiled slightly. "That is true." Adrian closed the book in his hands. "I think there are many things I do not know about you either." The honesty surprised Elliot. This was not the distant king who had spoken to him months ago. This was someone trying to understand. "Why now?" Elliot asked quietly. Adrian looked toward the tall windows overlooking the gardens. For a moment, he seemed unsure how to answer. "Because I spent too long believing I already knew the truth." Those words carried more weight than Elliot expected. Adrian Whitmore was not someone who admitted mistakes easily. Yet here he was, acknowledging that he had been wrong. The following days brought small changes between them. Adrian began inviting Elliot to join royal discussions, not because tradition required it, but because he valued his opinion. Elliot began seeing the person behind the crown. He discovered that Adrian was not cold because he lacked feelings. He was cautious because he had spent years carrying responsibilities alone. One afternoon, they walked through the palace gardens together, the same place where Elliot had once told Adrian he could not force someone to see his worth. This time, the silence between them felt different. It was not uncomfortable. It was peaceful. "Do you regret coming here?" Adrian suddenly asked. Elliot looked at him with surprise. "Coming here?" Adrian nodded. "The palace. This marriage. Everything." Elliot thought carefully before answering. "At first, yes." Adrian's expression changed slightly. Elliot continued. "I thought I had to become someone else to survive. But then I realized I did not need to change who I was. I only needed to stop forgetting my own value." Adrian looked at him quietly. Those words affected him more than he expected. Because deep down, Adrian understood that Elliot had done something he had never been able to do. He had found peace without needing anyone's approval. The king looked away for a moment before speaking softly. "I am glad you stayed." Elliot froze slightly. It was such a simple sentence, but from Adrian, it meant more than 1,000 grand promises. For the first time, Elliot wondered if the person standing beside him was no longer the man from the old story. Maybe he was someone writing a new one with him. And Adrian, who once believed he could never lose control of his own heart, finally understood the one thing he feared most. He did not want Elliot to walk away. Adrian had once believed that losing control was the greatest weakness a ruler could have. A king was supposed to remain calm, make decisions with a clear mind, and never allow personal feelings to interfere with duty. But as the days passed, Adrian discovered something he never expected. Sometimes, the hardest thing to control was not a kingdom. It was his own heart. The palace that once felt cold and distant slowly became different. Not because the walls had changed. Not because the responsibilities had disappeared. It changed because Elliot was there. The man who had once been a stranger in Adrian's eyes had become the person Adrian searched for without realizing it. Every morning, Adrian found himself looking forward to conversations that used to feel unnecessary. Every evening, he noticed when Elliot was not nearby. The change happened so naturally that Adrian almost missed it. Almost. Elliot noticed too. He saw the small differences in Adrian's actions. The way the king asked about his day. The way Adrian listened instead of assuming. The way he no longer looked at Elliot as someone he had to tolerate, but as someone whose thoughts mattered. Still, Elliot remained careful. He had learned that trust was not rebuilt through a few kind words. It was created through consistent actions. One evening, Adrian invited Elliot to walk through the palace gardens after sunset. The lights along the pathways created a warm glow, and the quiet atmosphere felt far removed from the tense moments they had shared when Elliot first arrived. They walked side by side, neither of them rushing to fill the silence. Finally, Adrian stopped near the fountain where they had spoken weeks before. "I owe you an apology," Adrian said. Elliot looked at him. The words were unexpected. "For what?" Adrian lowered his gaze for a moment. "For judging you before knowing you. For believing rumors instead of giving you a chance. For making you feel alone in a place that should have been your home." Elliot remained silent. He had imagined hearing those words many times in his old life, as Elliot Vallon. But now that they were finally spoken, they felt different. They were not a reward. They were not something he had waited for. They were simply the truth finally being acknowledged. "I cannot change the past," Adrian continued. "But I want to change what comes next." Elliot looked at the king standing before him. Not the ruler of Aurelian. Not the powerful man everyone respected. Just Adrian. A person who had made mistakes and was trying to become better. "Why?" Elliot asked softly. Adrian looked surprised by the question. "Why do you want to change now?" For a moment, Adrian had no answer. Then he spoke honestly. "Because I realized that the person I thought I could live without became the person I do not want to lose." The words stayed between them. Simple, honest, real. Elliot looked away, hiding the emotions he did not expect to feel. He had arrived in this world believing his only goal was survival. He thought he needed to avoid the ending written for him. He never expected that the greatest change would not be escaping the story. It would be changing the people inside it. Months later, the kingdom of Aurelian saw a different royal couple. Not one built only on duty or tradition, but one built on understanding. The people who once whispered about Elliot now respected him. The king who once stood apart from everyone learned how to let someone stand beside him. And Elliot finally understood that sometimes the person who starts as your greatest disappointment can become the person who changes your entire world. The story that was supposed to end with loneliness had become something completely different. Not because fate had been rewritten by chance, but because two people finally chose to see each other clearly.